My in-laws secretly sold my farm while I was on vacation. They texted, "We got a great price, stay away." They didn't know the buyer was my private LLC. When they tried to cash the check, they were arrested. That text arrived on a Wednesday morning, while I was sitting on a porch in the Smoky Mountains, with a cup of coffee watching fog lift off the valley below. My phone buzzed. I looked at it. My brother-in-law Raymond's name was on the screen. The message said, "Earl talked to the Hendersons. Got you a real good price for the property. Deal is done. Enjoy your vacation, no need to rush back." I read it twice. Then I set the coffee down. The farm on Route 9 outside Shelby, North Carolina, had been in my family since 1962. My father bought it with 11 years of savings and a loan from a credit union that took 3 applications before they approved it. He farmed tobacco and soybeans on it for 24 years. When he passed in 2006, he left it to me. Not to me and my wife jointly, not to the family broadly, specifically to me, by name, in a will that had been drawn up by an attorney and witnessed and filed with the county. My name was on the deed. My name alone. Raymond and his father Earl, my father-in-law, did not own the farm. They did not have power of attorney. They did not have my authorization. What they had was a handshake deal with a man named Curtis Henderson, and apparently, the specific confidence of people who had mistaken my patience for permission. I put the phone back on the porch railing. I watched the fog for about 30 more seconds. Then I called my attorney. What happened after that took 6 weeks to fully resolve, but the essential outcome was established in the first 48 hours. Because what Raymond and Earl did not know, what I had never mentioned to anyone in my wife's family because it had never seemed relevant, was that I had set up a private LLC 3 years earlier to manage my land holdings, and that the LLC had been quietly under contract to purchase the Route 9 farm for 60 days, while I arranged the financing to move the property into the entity correctly. The buyer Raymond had found was not the Hendersons. The buyer was my LLC. The check Raymond tried to deposit on Friday morning had my LLC's name on it. The bank flagged it immediately. The county sheriff's office was involved by noon. Hit that like button right now, subscribe if you are new here, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Every week a new story. Let me take you back to where all of this started. My name is James Beaumont Carroll, and I am 61 years old. I was born in Shelby, North Carolina in 1963, the second son of Robert and Ida Carroll. My father was a farmer and a carpenter, not one then the other, both simultaneously, the way men in rural North Carolina in that era were often 2 or 3 things at once, because one thing was rarely sufficient to sustain a family through the specific unpredictability of agricultural income. He farmed the Route 9 property from May to November, and he built things from November to April. Cabinets, furniture, additions to houses in the county, whatever people needed and could pay for. He was precise in the way that people who worked with wood developed precision, which was the understanding that a measurement that was slightly wrong produced a result that was entirely wrong, and that the time to correct a measurement was before you made the cut. He said this to me when I was about 10, while I was helping him frame a wall addition on a neighbor's house. I had measured something incorrectly and cut a piece of lumber that was 3/4 of an inch short, and he did not raise his voice about it. He just picked up the piece and looked at it and said, "The measurement was wrong before the cut. Find where the measurement went wrong." I found it. I had moved the tape before I recorded the number. He said, "Record first, then move, every time." I have applied that principle to almost every significant decision I have made in the 61 years since. My mother Ida was the organizational intelligence of the household. She kept the books for the farm and for my father's carpentry work simultaneously, which required the specific kind of mental flexibility that people who were genuinely good with numbers developed. the ability to hold multiple accounting systems in your head without confusing the entries. She was also the person in the family who read everything. Every document that came into the house went through Ida Carroll before any action was taken on it. She read leases, contracts, loan documents, government forms with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who understood that the language in a document was not decoration but instruction. She taught me to read documents the way my father taught me to measure wood. Find where the measurement went wrong. Read the document completely before you act on it. Those two instructions from two people shaped the next 50 years. My older brother Thomas took to farming in the natural way of someone for whom the land was a calling rather than a profession. He farmed with our father from the time he was 16. He had a physical relationship with the Route 9 property that was difficult to describe. He knew every acre of it by its specific soil character, its drainage patterns, its seasonal behavior. He could walk a field in March and tell you what it would do in August. I was different from Thomas in this. I loved the farm, but I loved it as a thing to understand rather than a thing to inhabit. Where Thomas wanted to be in the fields, I wanted to understand the economics of what the fields produced, what the commodity markets were doing, what the cost inputs meant for the margin, what the difference was between a year that worked and a year that didn't, and what you could control about that difference. I went to Appalachian State in 1981 and studied agricultural economics and business administration. 4 years of formalizing what my mother had been teaching me at the kitchen table with the farm's account books since I was 12. I graduated in 1985 and came back to Shelby. Not to farm, Thomas had that covered, and he was better at it than I would have been. I came back because the county had the specific pattern of agricultural land transactions that I had been watching since college, and that I believed I understood well enough to build something from. I went to work for a small agricultural land brokerage in Shelby. 3 people, a modest office on Lafayette Street, a client list of farmers and rural landowners who needed someone to help them understand what their land was worth and what the options were for it. I spent 7 years there. Those 7 years were the education that no classroom produced. I sat across from farmers who had owned land for 40 years and who did not understand what they had. I sat across from buyers who understood the land's value and who were prepared to pay less than that value to sellers who did not know the difference. I sat across from heirs who had inherited agricultural property and who needed to understand whether to farm it, sell it, lease it, or hold it, and what each option actually meant in financial terms. I became very good at helping people understand what their land was actually worth. In 1992, I started Carroll Agricultural Properties. Just me and a part-time administrative assistant named Donna, who had worked for the previous brokerage, and who came with me because she said the previous owner had not appreciated her organizational capabilities, and she intended to work for someone who would. Donna's organizational capabilities were exceptional, and I appreciated them completely for 21 years until she retired in 2013. The business grew the way a business in a specialized field grew, through the specific trust that developed when you consistently gave people accurate information rather than the information that was easiest to give. Agricultural land valuation was not complicated, but it required honesty. The land was worth what it was worth based on its specific characteristics and the specific market conditions at the specific time, not what the seller hoped it was worth. Not what would make the seller feel good about the transaction, what it actually was. I had a reputation for telling people what their land actually was. This produced referrals. The referrals produced clients. The clients produced a business that by 2000 had 4 brokers and an administrative team of 3 and revenues that were sustaining everyone comfortably. In 2003, I met my wife Carolyn at a county agricultural association dinner that neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and that a mutual friend had suggested we both go to with the same social engineering instinct that mutual friends had been deploying since the beginning of organized social life. Carolyn was a high school history teacher in Kings Mountain. She was 40 years old, direct in her communication, genuinely funny in the dry, specific way of someone who had spent 20 years teaching teenagers and who had developed humor as a professional tool. She was also the daughter of Earl Pratt, who farmed corn and soybeans on 300 acres outside Kings Mountain, and who had opinions about land and farming and the proper conduct of agricultural business that were strongly held and frequently expressed. We were married in 2005. Subscribe right now and stay with me. Earl Pratt was 68 years old when Carolyn and I married, and he had the specific quality of a man who had been the central authority in every room he had occupied for 40 years, and who had not significantly updated this self-assessment since approximately 1985. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been right about enough things in his life that being wrong had become genuinely uncomfortable for him, and whose response to discomfort was usually to find a way to reframe the situation so that he was not wrong. He was also a man who had very specific ideas about what a husband was supposed to be and what a son-in-law was supposed to do, and how agricultural property was supposed to be managed. And those ideas had been formed in a particular era of rural North Carolina life and had not substantially evolved. He tolerated me. I want to be precise about that because tolerated is the accurate word. He tolerated me because Carolyn loved me and because I was in the agricultural business, which was a field he respected, and because I was generally quiet and did not argue with him when he said things that were wrong, which happened regularly. The not arguing was a deliberate choice. My father had taught me to find where the measurement went wrong before cutting the wood. I was still measuring Earl. Raymond was Earl's son and Carolyn's brother. He was 4 years younger than Carolyn, 43 when Carolyn and I married. He worked on his father's farm and did some contract work in the county. He was a decent man in most contexts and a specific kind of problem in others. The problem he was in other contexts was that he shared his father's belief that he understood agricultural business better than he actually did. And unlike his father, he did not have 40 years of being occasionally right to anchor the belief. Raymond had opinions about my land the way some people had opinions about other people's cars, from the outside, with confidence, based on how things looked rather than what they were. He mentioned the Route 9 farm in passing conversations more times than was natural over the first 10 years of my marriage to Carolyn. The farm was underperforming. The farm was too much land for one person to manage properly without living on it. The farm could bring good money if timed right. The farm was sitting idle while good opportunities passed. I heard all of it. I did not respond to most of it. What I was doing was the same thing I had been doing since 1985 with clients who came to me with land they did not understand. I was tracking the information, what the property actually was, what the market was doing, what the options were, what the right timing looked like. In 2019, I made a decision that I did not announce to anyone in my wife's family. I set up a private LLC called Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings. The LLC was established to hold land assets in a structure that provided specific legal and tax benefits for properties that were part of a longer-term land management strategy. My attorney, a man named Gerald Wyatt who had been handling my business affairs since 1995, handled the formation. He was methodical and specific, and the LLC documentation was complete and correct. The Route 9 farm was not immediately transferred to the LLC. The transfer required financing arrangements that I was working through over several months, and that involved a formal purchase transaction between me personally and the LLC as the buyer. The LLC had a commercial bank account, a registered agent, and a physical address. It was entirely legitimate. It was not publicly advertised. In March of 2022, I began the formal process of transferring the Route 9 farm into Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings. Gerald drew up the purchase agreement. The LLC arranged financing through a commercial lender. The transaction was structured to close in 60 days. The closing was scheduled for June. I planned the vacation in the Smoky Mountains for May. The timing was not related. I had been planning the vacation since January. Carolyn and I went to the same cabin in the Smokies every May. We had been doing it since 2008. What I did not know when we left for the cabin in the second week of May was that Raymond had been making calls. Subscribe right now and stay here. What Raymond had been doing, I pieced together afterward from conversations with Gerald and from the information that came out during the legal process. He had been watching the Route 9 farm with the specific attention of someone who had decided that the asset was not being maximized, and who had further decided that he was the person equipped to maximize it. Over the winter, he had connected with a man named Curtis Henderson, who was a land developer in the Shelby area, and who was in the habit of acquiring agricultural properties and converting them to residential subdivision development. Raymond and Earl had visited Curtis Henderson in April. What they told him, I cannot say with certainty, but the outcome of the visit was that Curtis Henderson believed he was negotiating to purchase the Route 9 farm from people who had authority to sell it. They did not have authority to sell it. They did not have my power of attorney. They did not have any document authorizing them to act on my behalf. What they had was the confidence that the property had always been a family matter, and that James Carroll was not the type to make a scene about things, and that by the time I got back from the mountains it would be done, and the check would be cashed, and the situation would be presented to me as a favor. Curtis Henderson believed he was getting a good deal. Raymond and Earl believed they were being helpful. Nobody in the transaction had read the deed to confirm who actually owned the property. My mother would have read the deed. Record first, then move. The text arrived Wednesday morning. We got you a great price for the property. Enjoy your vacation. I set the coffee down and called Gerald. Gerald said, James, tell me exactly what the text says. I told him. There was a specific quality to Gerald's silence. He said, they do not know about the LLC. I said no. He said, and they do not know about the purchase agreement. I said no. He said, James, what was the name on the check? I said, what do you mean? He said, when Curtis Henderson wrote a check to close this transaction, whose name did he put on it? I thought about this. I said, that depends on what Raymond told him. Gerald said, I am going to call Curtis Henderson's office right now. Give me 20 minutes. He called back in 15. He said, James, Curtis Henderson made the check out to Earl Pratt and Raymond Pratt as agents for the sale of Route 9 agricultural property. I said, that is not a legitimate payee. Gerald said, correct. They have no legal standing to receive proceeds from a sale of property they do not own. But more importantly, and this is what you need to understand, Curtis Henderson signed a purchase agreement and wrote a check to close a property that is already under contract to Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings. I said he bought property that was already sold. Gerald said he attempted to. The contract with Blue Ridge predates the contract with Henderson by 60 days. Henderson's contract is not valid because the sellers had no authority to sign it and the property was already under contract to another buyer. I said, what happens when Earl and Raymond try to deposit the check? Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, James, what I need to know right now is whether you want to handle this privately or whether you want to involve law enforcement. I thought about this. I thought about Earl pressing his opinions on my business decisions for 17 years. I thought about Raymond's certainty that the farm was being mismanaged. I thought about the text that said stay away. I said, Gerald, they used my property to enter a fraudulent sales agreement without my knowledge or consent while I was on vacation. They received a check for property they had no legal right to sell. What does the law say about that? Gerald said, it is fraud. I said, then I am not handling it privately. Gerald said, I will call the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office this afternoon. He called the sheriff's office. He also called Curtis Henderson's attorney to explain the situation with the pre-existing Blue Ridge contract. Curtis Henderson was unhappy. Curtis Henderson was also a sophisticated enough businessman to understand that he had been deceived and that his recourse was against the people who had deceived him rather than against the legitimate property owner. By Thursday afternoon, the county sheriff's office had been fully briefed. By Friday morning, Raymond and Earl walked into their bank with the check. The bank manager was holding a call from the sheriff's office that had arrived 45 minutes earlier. The arrest happened in the bank. Subscribe right now and stay right here. Carolyn found out on Friday afternoon. I had driven back from the Smokies Thursday night. Not in anger, I was not operating from anger by that point. I had done what needed to be done, and I was operating from clarity, which was a different and more useful state. Carolyn was at the house when I arrived. She had spoken to Raymond before his arrest, and she knew something was happening but not the full picture. I sat with her at the kitchen table, and I told her the full picture. She listened the way Carolyn listened to difficult things, completely and without interrupting, with the expression of someone who was receiving information and not yet responding to it because the response required more than the information in isolation. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. She said, "My father and my brother tried to sell your farm." I said, "Yes." She said, "Without asking you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "While you were on vacation?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And they were arrested at the bank?" I said, "Yes." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "James, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly." I said, "Okay." She said, "Was there anything you could have done before this happened to make the situation clearer?" I thought about this. I said, "I could have told your father and Raymond about the LLC arrangement. That would have made clear that the property was in the process of a formal transfer and would have communicated unambiguously that it was not available." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because the property was mine. My father left it to me. My name is on the deed. I have not previously been required to brief your family on my business decisions about my own assets." She said, "I know that." She said, "I am asking why specifically in this case you did not communicate something that might have prevented what happened." I sat with that. I said, "Carolyn, your father has spent 17 years expressing opinions about the Route 9 farm. Raymond has made comments about it being underperforming and mismanaged for most of that same period. I have listened to all of it, and I have not argued with any of it, and I have managed the property according to my own assessment of what it required. I did not tell them about the LLC arrangement because I did not think I owed them a preview of my business decisions. That was my mistake, in the sense that it left a gap that Raymond decided to fill." She said it was their mistake. I said, "Yes, the larger mistake was theirs, but I am acknowledging the part that was mine." She said, "Okay." She looked at her hands. She said, "What happens to them now?" I said, "That depends on how the legal process develops. Gerald is working with the county attorney. Curtis Henderson's attorney is involved. The charges are fraud and forgery based on the falsified sales documents. What the outcome is will depend on what they were actually told about their authority and what they understood about what they were doing." She said, "My father is 75. I said, "I know." She said, Raymond has 3 kids. I said, I know that too. She said, James. I said, yes. She said, I am not asking you to make this go away. What they did was wrong. I understand what they did was wrong. She said, I am asking you what kind of man you are going to be in this. I looked at her across the table. She looked back at me with the expression she had when she was asking me something she already knew the answer to, but needed to hear me say. I said, I am going to be the same man I have always been. I am going to tell the truth about what happened. I am going to let the legal process work through what the legal process works through. And when there is a moment where my input into the outcome is relevant, I am going to say that the purpose of what happened here was not to destroy 2 people's lives. It was to make clear that my property is my property and that decisions about it are mine to make. She said, that is the answer I needed. I said, I know. She said, I am going to have to talk to my father. I said, yes. She said, that is going to be one of the hardest conversations I have ever had. I said, yes, it is. She said, will you come with me? I said, if you want me there, I will be there. She said, I want you there. We went to Earl's house on Saturday morning. Earl was home. He had been released the previous afternoon. The specific quality of a man who had been arrested and released and who was sitting in his own house the morning after was difficult to describe. The confidence that had been the constant atmospheric condition of every room Earl Pratt entered was simply gone, not replaced by something else, just absent. He looked old. He looked like a 75-year-old man who had made a very serious mistake and who understood, possibly for the first time in his adult life, what the specific cost of being wrong could be. I sat across from him. Carolyn sat beside me. He said, James. I said, Earl. He said, I thought I was helping. I said, I know you did. He said, I thought the property was just sitting there and you weren't doing anything with it and someone could get good value. I said, the property was not sitting there. I had it under contract to my own LLC. The transfer was scheduled for June. The arrangement was already in place. He said, I didn't know about any LLC. I said, no, you didn't. He said, I should have asked. I said, yes. He said, James, I want to tell you something. I said, tell me. He said, I have not always been easy about your business. I have had opinions I expressed that were not mine to express, about the farm and about how you managed it, and about what I thought you should have been doing differently. I said, yes. He said, I was wrong about all of it. He said it without qualification, without the specific reframing that people applied to acknowledgments to make them slightly less complete, just directly, in the flat, honest way of a man who had nothing left to protect. I said, Earl, the farm was my father's farm. He bought it with 11 years of savings. He farmed it for 24 years. He left it to me because he trusted me to take care of it. I have taken care of it for 17 years. He said, I know. I said, the decisions about what to do with it have always been mine. I want that to be clear going forward. He said, it is clear. He looked at Carolyn. He said, I am sorry, Carolyn. She did not say it was okay. She was too honest for that. She said, I know, Daddy. Raymond's situation was legally more complicated because Raymond had been the one who made the calls and signed the documents and presented himself to Curtis Henderson as having authority he did not have. Earl had been present at the meeting with Henderson, but Raymond had been the primary actor. The charges against both of them were ultimately reduced through a process that I will be honest about. Gerald communicated to the county attorney that my primary interest was in protecting my property rights and not in destroying my wife's family. The county attorney took that into account. Curtis Henderson, whose cooperation was essential and who was both angry and practical, decided that what he most wanted was his money back and a formal acknowledgement that the transaction was void. Both of those things happened. The outcome was a plea agreement for Raymond that included probation, a fine, and a formal record of the conviction. Earl's involvement was treated differently given his age and his more limited role in the active fraud. He was not charged with the same offenses. The Route 9 farm closed into Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings in June as scheduled. Subscribe right now and stay with me for the final section. The farm on Route 9 in Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings produced its first leasing income in August of that year. I had leased it to a family who had been farming cotton and soybeans in Cleveland County for 3 generations and who needed additional acreage and who had the specific relationship with land that the land deserved. The family's patriarch was 71, and his hands showed it. He walked the Route 9 fields the same way Thomas had walked them, with the physical knowledge of someone who understood land from the ground up rather than from a spreadsheet. I stood at the fence line watching him walk the north field, and I thought about my father building that same field into something worth leaving. I thought about the measurement that my father had taught me. Record first, then move. My father had recorded his life in that farm for 24 years, and then he had moved, and what he left was the record. I had been recording my life in it since 2006. Earl Pratt came to the Route 9 farm in September. Carolyn had not asked him to come. I had not asked him to come. He called me on a Tuesday and asked if he could drive out, and I said yes. He arrived at the property in the morning. He got out of his truck and he stood at the gate and he looked out over the fields. The tenant family had planted a winter cover crop that was coming in green across the north acreage. He said, "It looks good." I said, "The new tenants know what they're doing." He said, "Who are they?" I told him. He nodded. He knew the family. He knew them in the way that people in agricultural communities knew each other, by their work and by their reputation and by the specific quality of their relationship with land. He said, "Good family." I said, "Yes." He said, "Your father would have liked them." I said, "Probably." He said, "James, I want to walk the property, if that's all right with you." I opened the gate. We walked the Route 9 farm for an hour. Earl did not say much. He looked at things. He looked at the drainage at the low end of the south field, and he looked at the fence line on the eastern boundary, and he looked at the equipment shed where my father's tools still hung on the wall the way my father had hung them. At the equipment shed he stopped. He said, "Your father built this shed." I said, 1978. He and Thomas built it in a weekend. He said, "The framing is still solid." I said, "My father believed in building things solid." Earl looked at the shed for a moment. He said, "I spent 30 years thinking I knew more about farming and land than most people." I said, "You know a great deal." He said, "I do not know as much as I thought." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact he had arrived at. I said, "You know what your land has needed for 40 years. That is real knowledge." He said, "But not other people's land." I said, "That is the distinction, yes." He said, "Raymond understood that even less." I said, "Raymond will have time to develop a different kind of understanding." Earl looked at his hands. He said, "I have been hard on you." I said, "Yes." He said, "From the beginning of you and Carolyn, I had an idea of what I wanted for her, and you did not match the idea." I said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong about that." He said, "You have taken care of her. You have taken care of your business. You have taken care of this farm the way it should have been taken care of. I just could not see it because I was too busy telling you what I thought you should be doing differently." I said, "Earl, Carolyn makes her own choices. She chose me because she chose me. What you thought about the match was between you and yourself." He said, "You are right." He looked at the equipment shed one more time. He said, "Your father hung those tools in the same order every time." I said he could find anything in the dark. He knew exactly where everything was because he always put everything in the same place. Earl said, "That is a good practice." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "James." I said, "Earl." He said, "Thank you for letting me walk the property." I said, "It is a good property." He said, "Yes, it is." He drove back to Kings Mountain. I stood at the equipment shed for a while after he left. I looked at my father's tools on the wall. Everything in the same place. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. The farm was in Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings, and the tenants were doing good work on it, and the documentation was clean and correct and filed properly. And there was nothing about the arrangement that was ambiguous or unclear or available to be misread by someone who had not read the deed. Record first, then move. Carolyn called me from inside the farmhouse, where she had been since we arrived. She said, "Are you coming in?" I said, "Give me a minute." She said, "The coffee is ready." I said, "1 minute." I stood in the September morning on the Route 9 property. I thought about my father buying this land with 11 years of savings and a credit union loan that took 3 applications. I thought about my grandfather building his house in 14 months on evenings and weekends. I thought about what it meant to build something that lasted, not because it was impervious to the people who wanted to take it, because the foundation was correct. A wall that doesn't give is a wall built by someone who understood what it was holding up. The farm did not give. I went inside for coffee. I want to tell you something straight before you go. Earl and Raymond were not villains. They were people who made a serious mistake from a specific combination of arrogance and carelessness, and the particular blindness that came from having opinions about other people's property, without ever having been required to examine those opinions carefully. Earl had been telling me what he thought about the Route 9 farm since 2005. He was never right about it, but he kept saying it because nobody had ever made the saying cost anything. Until it cost something. I did not engineer what happened to make them pay for 17 years of opinions. I set up a legitimate business structure for legitimate reasons, and when they tried to sell my property without my authorization, the structure became visible in a way that produced real legal consequences. That is not revenge. That is what happens when you build things correctly. The foundation was right. The documentation was right. The legal structure was right. When someone tried to move something that was correctly built, it did not move. The thing that was not built correctly, Raymond's fraudulent sales agreement, fell apart immediately on contact with what was actually in place. My father taught me to find where the measurement went wrong. The measurement in what Raymond and Earl did went wrong the moment they decided that my property was something they had authority over. That was where the measurement went wrong. Everything that followed was just the consequence of that error finding its natural end. The Route 9 farm is leased to people who understand land. Blue Ridge Agricultural Holdings is documented and correctly structured. The deed says what it has always said. Carolyn and I go to the Smokies every May. Drop a comment and tell me about the time someone tried to act on something that was yours without asking. Tell me what the foundation was that protected it. Tell me where you are watching from. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. New story every week and everyone earns your time. Thank you for being here.